Welcome, everyone, to the Ken Keltner. Actually, it's a joint chapter meeting. So I want to welcome everyone with Ken Keltner, the Chicago Emil Rothe chapter, the Minnesota Halsey Hall chapter, and the Central Illinois chapter, as well as attendees from all over. And I want to welcome John Miller, the host, the author of The Last Manager. Just a fantastic book. I'm more than halfway done, and it's just fascinating and very well written. Um, Highly recommend. In the chat I put a link to John's website. It's a really good website. There's some really good articles and all sorts of info. I guess you mentioned there's a great article in the Washington Post recently. Ed Emmons forwarded an article from the New York Times about the book. So a lot of good feedback on it. So I'm going to ask everyone maybe to turn off their audio and video during John's presentation, and then you can release that for questions at the end. So I'll turn it over to John if he's ready.
I am, yeah. Thanks everybody, and thank you for accommodating my time request. Appreciate it. So for those of you who weren't here in the beginning, this is my newborn son wearing a onesie that friends of mine made. Oscar was born January 7th. So I've had my first book and my first child arrive like basically at the same time. So it's been a very busy time. So how did the book come about? Here we go. I grew up a baseball fan in Brussels, Belgium. My parents are from Maryland. My mom's from Baltimore. They're musicians. They settled in Europe in the 1970s. As I like to joke, they fled the terror of the Ford administration. They were backpacking through Europe and found my dad got a job playing the piano at the Brussels Opera House. And they would take me back to Baltimore on summer vacations. And I fell in love with the Orioles and Memorial Stadium. And it was kind of, the Orioles at that time were not good. It was late 80s. And I became obsessed with their glory days, which were before I was born or while, I was very little in the 70s, and particularly with Earl Weaver, because he clearly had something to do with it. And I was enchanted by his books, the memoir with Barry Steinbeck especially, which seemed to have this kind of humanity and comedy and darkness and almost like a Shakespearean complexity. Even as a little kid, I could tell reading this book. And I grew up again, no television in Europe in the 80s. Read the newspaper. The English language paper then was the International Herald Tribune, which was basically the best of the Washington Post and the New York Times. And so I would read Tom Boswell, the Washington Post sports writer, and he was, infatuated with Earl Weaver. He was Weaver's Boswell, if you will. And so I became, again, very just like, focused on Earl Weaver. And as I played baseball at Mount St. Mary's in Maryland, and then in my 20s and 30s, played in a men's league and coached a lot and took teams my brothers were on to Little League World Series tournaments. And again, kept on following the Orioles and was, along with the theatricality and the kind of the professional wrestling comedy of Earl Weaver, was very interested in why he was so good and where he came from, honestly. And at the same time, as I was doing these things in baseball, including scouting for the Orioles in Europe a little bit, I joined the Wall Street Journal as a staff reporter. I was a global economics reporter, global trade reporter. Moved to Pittsburgh in 2011 and became the global mining reporter for the Wall Street Journal. On January 19th, 2013, Earl Weaver died, and the sports editor called me and said, would you like to write his obituary? And I said, yes, of course. This is a great idea. And I did it in like 2 hours. And I realized I had this like familiarity with the story. And as I was doing that, I thought there's got to be more to do here. And I kind of parked that idea in the back of my head. And, I kept on working at the Journal. And then I left the Wall Street Journal. I made a film for PBS, and I was looking for other projects. And, it was sort of surprised nobody else had done this book before because, Earl Weaver is in Moneyball. He's in the Schwartz book, The Numbers Game. Every book about the history of statistics or analytics or modern baseball says, this guy was doing all these things before anybody else. And I just kept on wondering why had nobody done this? But there have been 4 books, as I said before. And so, at the Wall Street Journal, we had a couple rules. One was to over report, find out more than you have to. The other was to never be derivative, never do something that has already been done. So I started thinking about, if I had to do a book, would there be new things to find about Earl Weaver? And I kind of had a clue in his memoir, in this little screenshot I put here on the page, where he talks about his Uncle Bud. And his Uncle Bud was a bookkeeper. And it only took a few searches on newspapers.com to realize that there was a lot more to this story. I mean, this guy was arrested every year for illegal gambling, for bookmaking. He was a violent, quasi, low-level mobster. Once got drunk and shot his wife. Clearly a bad person. Clearly, also, as you can tell by the Earl Weaver's tone, somebody who was close to Earl Weaver, and somebody who had a lot of influence on him. And so, as I, again, tried to think about what a book would look like, I thought, well, it has to be about the full person. And Earl Weaver has this kind of comedy, but also like this darkness and this anger. And so it would have to be both. And I thought, well, obviously the uncle here, there's more to say. And obviously this can help explain Earl Weaver's, uh, uh, the violence almost of his demeanor sometimes, and the drinking, and again, the flawed, the fallen man part of this story. Um, Selling the book, was not easy. Like most books, it's not that easy to you find an agent, and then 24 agents ignored me, or 21 ignored me. Three said no, but wrote constructive rejections. And it was only a conversation with, Jonathan Eig, the Chicago-based writer, the Martin Luther King biographer, who advised me to make it about Earl Weaver's failures, and make the payoff the 70s and the Orioles' glory days, as opposed to like a book about why the Orioles were so good in the 70s. So then again, the arc became clear. It would be about his childhood and his uncle, and then the long purgatory in the minor leagues, and then culminating in the Orioles' glory days, and the invention of analytics, and et cetera. I mean, one thing I sort of wanted to emphasize too is just how famous Earl Weaver was. And this is I include the Playboy magazine because it's sort of forgotten now, but the interview was a big cultural signifier in the 1980s, and he was a Playboy interview the same year as Gabriel Marquez, who had just won a Nobel Prize for Literature, and Stephen King, the best-selling writer, and Ted Turner of CNN, and Ansel Adams, the great photographer. That's how famous Earl Weaver was, and he had his own book on cabs in New York City. Um, and again, as I kept on pulling at strings, it turns out Earl's grandson is this very funny character in St. Louis who goes by Clownvis. And here I am wearing a Clownvis shirt. And it's one of his most popular songs titled "Don't Be a Bitch or You Won't Get Stuff for Christmas." And that's Earl Weaver's daughter, Terry, at a Clownvis show. And on the left is Uncle Bud. This is a picture the family gave me. So as I started getting to know the family, they started opening up. It became clear that like there was a sort of bigger American story, from this mob uncle to the grandson who had the half clown, half Elvis act, which was very funny. Um, the and trying to understand, because obviously I wasn't there in the stands with Earl Weaver and Uncle Bud. I tried to understand the mentality of gamblers in the 40s. And on eBay and other places, I found these old gambling guides from the 40s, which I found completely fascinating. They were essentially proto-analytics. They said things like, don't bunt, it's not a good strategy, or the intentional walk is a counterproductive strategy, or always be mindful of particular pitcher batter matchups and how they might be predictive. And these were all things that Earl Weaver became famous for doing, that not intentionally walking people, not bunting, and keeping records of pitcher batter confrontations. Well, this was all suggested in these gambling guides. So again, I couldn't be there with Earl and Uncle Bud in the stands of Sportsman's Park, but they gave me like a clue of what or how he might have thought about baseball, and his approach to baseball, what that might have been. This is Mike Leahy, Clownvis, and Earl's daughter Terry, and me on my first trip to St. Louis. Um, so, one of the things that was what was known about Earl Weaver, or said about Earl Weaver, was that he was not a good player. Well, it turns out that his first 4 seasons in the minor leagues, 3 of them he was team MVP, and then he was selected to go to the St. Louis Cardinals spring training in St. Petersburg, Florida, in 1952. And he had a very good spring training. He hit 260, had a couple home runs, was second on the team in RBI. and then got cut in the last week of the season by Eddie Stanky, the manager, who wanted to be himself the backup infielder. And so Eddie Stanky, in a kind of miscarriage of justice, and Earl in his memoir kind of obliquely says, this is what made me very depressed, made me drink a lot, and set me on this long purgatory in the minor leagues. And this is Amy Berra, who's the Cardinals archivist, no relation to Yogi, although Yogi played in the same Legion program as Earl Weaver and was nicknamed Yogi by one of Earl Weaver's teammates at Beaumont High School in St. Louis. And so Amy, they just received Earl Weaver's spring training uniform from 1952. So I invited Terry, Earl's daughter, and Mike, aka Clownvis, to the Cardinals archives to check it out. And we had a great time looking at this uniform. And Terry brought with her a box of mementos that her dad had left her, and they included like a World Series ring, all this like really cool stuff. But most importantly for Earl, she said, was these box scores where uh, Earl Weaver was batting, first in the lineup, in the same lineup as Stan Musial and Eno Slaughter, who had been his childhood heroes. These were men that Earl Weaver, only like 5 years before, was watching in the stands as a boy, as a teenager. So if you imagine like seeing your favorite players as a teenager, 5 years later, you're playing with them in the same lineup and you do well. Like you don't flail, like you don't drop out. You actually hold your own and then you get cut. And so that offered, again, more of a complexity to the Earl Weaver story. He wasn't just a failed player. He was somebody who was, and I write in the book, he was a great talent evaluator because he knew the bar between major and minor league talent because he was the bar. He was the essential quadruple A player. And again, this trip to St. Louis really crystallized it for me. Here I am holding Stan Musial's bat. Uh, Weaver and Musial died on the same day, January 19th, 2013. An incredible coincidence. And so the childhood of Earl Weaver also became, again, very interesting to me. And I had never written a book before. And one of the pieces of advice I got was, well, make it scenes, like, describe scenes. And so I wanted to see like St. Louis and urban St. Louis. This is an incredible picture somebody from the family gave me of a Earl Weaver as a toddler, looking like he's about to charge the mound and berate an umpire, even at age 4. And this is his high school, Beaumont High School, which was this famous big city public high school that had like 7 big leaguers. Roy Sievers went there, Freddie Hoffman. Earl had this coach, Ray Elliott. I tracked down Ray Elliott's son, Pat, who gave me practice plans from the 1940s. And again, I'm somebody who, I coach high school baseball now and I played in college. Like, I just love all the baseball, the technical parts of these, and reading about how they used to do practices in the 40s. Like they would practice indoors with tennis balls, and that was considered revolutionary during the winter. And he would rig up strike zones with volleyball poles, and he played pepper, but long distance pepper from 60 feet, where they would throw strikes from 60 feet. He was obsessed with strike throwing. He would keep records of how many strikes people threw in the gym in the off season. And again, this is all like molding the character of Earl Weaver, who himself was obsessed with strike throwing and would demote people for not throwing strikes, and had this philosophy of basically throw the ball down the middle, just change speeds. Don't throw the same pitch twice, but don't try to hit the corners, throw it down the middle. And I think this all came from Coach Elliott. And again, decoding that and figuring out the baseball DNA was a big part of this project. And I didn't want to just repeat the same, 12 stories about Earl Weaver and umpires. And they're in the book, but I wanted to add something. So that's where this trip to St. Louis came into play. The vacant lot on the picture on the left, that's where Earl Weaver lived as a kid. That's where his uncle and his dad threw him pitches in the backyard. There were 89 public fields in St. Louis in the 40s. He would just walk to the field, play a game, often then go to the Cardinals or Browns game after his own game. The picture on the right is the house where he was born in 1930. His sister, who was 4, was named Earlene. So the Earl and Ethel had Earl and Earlene. His dad was a laundryman for the St. Louis Cardinals. Well, sort of like they were hustlers. So his dad had a bunch of businesses and he had these contracts. It wasn't like he was the full-time employee of the team. He would like get contracts once in a while to do laundry. And again, this is a working class culture in the 30s, a world of crowded taverns and barbershops and bookies. And I wanted to describe that and paint that picture in the book. So Earl Weaver at age 17 is signed by the Cardinals. He pretty much only cared about baseball. You see his yearbook picture here, Beaumont High senior, juggling baseballs. And that's him as a young minor leaguer. He did not express interest in anything else. There was a questionnaire I found from the minor leagues, and it's in, I think it might be on actually one of the SABR archives, and it says other interests, and he just wrote none. So that's who Earl Weaver was. He was obsessed with baseball from the time he was a small boy. Um, his first a trip out of St. Louis, he takes a train from St. Louis to Albany, Georgia. So I went there on a road trip to all the places in Georgia where Earl Weaver played. Um, uh, Teams after the war would lease military installations to have spring trainings on. So the Cardinals leased this Air Force base that had been built in a hurry to defeat the Nazis in World War II. And so they had taken over this Air Force base and they had 7 baseball fields. And minor league baseball between World War II and the Korean War was just booming. There was like 500 teams and 50 leagues, and so they had lots of room for players. And they would just give kids these tickets to these spring training camps, just assign them to places. And so Earl Weaver took the train. At that time, there were 19 train lines going through St. Louis. He gets off the train after a 24-hour ride in this little town. And this is a picture of what it looks like today. Albany, Georgia, gets assigned to uh, uh, Illinois, West Frankfort, Illinois, for his first minor league assignment. Um, and then after so he has his 4 good years in the minors, has the spring training with the Cardinals, plays well, but is sent down and never gets another shot. Develops his drinking habit, and is sort of on his way out of baseball when the Orioles notice. Well, first of all, he gets hired by the Knoxville Smokies as their manager in '56, and Harry Dalton, who's traveling through the country looking for talent, sees this like barking, raving little third base coach manager and hires him pretty much on the spot and thinks this is somebody we want for the Orioles. And the Orioles send him to Thomasville, Georgia, which is their version of the Cardinals Albany place. This is a former military hospital for veterans suffering from different kinds of illnesses. And the Orioles take over part of the grounds for their spring training. And Jim Palmer has these stories of snakes in the grass of the outfield, and just a very interesting, colorful place. And so I went there. I went to Thomasville. Now it's a juvenile detention center. And again, all these things to me like also tell these bigger stories about America, because it goes from being a veterans hospital to a spring training place to now it's a juvenile detention center. Um, Obviously, it's a sad outcome. And this is the field where Orioles prospects played, where people like Jim Palmer, Boog Powell were trained, and they had this development of this so-called Oriole Way that Earl Weaver was so important in putting into place. And in Cooperstown at the Hall of Fame, there's a copy of the Oriole Way in Harry Dalton's papers, so I was able to find that. And again, put myself in the scene of Earl Weaver and these coaches in Thomasville, Georgia, implementing the Oriole Way. This is a man who's the son of the contractor who built the Orioles infrastructure in Thomasville. And he told me about how they had this the bird's nest room where they would evaluate players, and they had this big orange bird, like the cartoon Oriole bird, and they had a hole in the bird's mouth, and the coaches would drink beer, and then the hole was the trash can, so they would drink the beer and then put the beer cans in the bird's mouth, which I thought was pretty funny. And Earl, players would sneak up behind the window and try to overhear the coaches talking about who they were going to keep, who they were going to cut. And Earl was, he developed his talent evaluation there. And you can see also there was this integration with the community in this little ad I found in the paper down there. And the librarian in Thomasville was very helpful. They had all these old pictures nobody had seen before that I was able to find and include some in the book. And just a really, really fascinating, fruitful a trip. And John Eisenberg and his oral history of the Orioles from 33rd Street to Camden Yards. There's a whole chapter about Thomasville, but I don't think any reporter or any journalist or writer had actually been there to see what it looked like and to go to the archives. And so that, again, as a Wall Street Journal reporter, that was kind of in my DNA to over-report and find out more than I had to. I talked to 3 umpires, Dave Phillips, Larry Barnett, and Jim Evans, and got some stories I hadn't heard before. The best one was Jim Evans told me before a game in the '70s. He said, Earl said, someday, Jim, they're going to have a robots calling the balls and strikes, and we're not going to need you guys. And Jim says he told Earl, and Earl, someday they're going to have computers doing the job of the managers, and they're not going to need you guys. which I thought was a pretty amazing story. And so again, I tried to not, some of the one-liners, like the famous, the Earl umpire says, "Look at my rule book," and Earl says, "I can't read your rule book," and the umpire says, "Why?" And Earl says, "Because it's in Braille." Like some of those lines are too good to not include. So I tried to repeat those. Oh, there's one story which was I read every book about managing I could find, and one of them was by Peter Pasquarelli. It was a biography of Jim Leland, and there's a story in that book that's so ridiculous. It can't possibly be true, but I put it in the book with a kind of a wink, and it's one where Dean Chance that talks about Earl's in like Aberdeen, South Dakota, and he gets so mad at an umpire's call, they throw him out, and Earl's so mad he climbs up the center field flagpole and watches the rest of the game from the top of the flagpole. And after the game, he can't get down, and so they send the fire department to get him down as if he's a cat. And so Peter Pasquarelli just relays this story in this book about Jim Leland as if it were true. I could not find a second source. It's probably not true. I put it in with like, the tone of like, tall tales were starting to spread about Earl. And again, there was this electrifying quality to his performances that I think came from partly his background with the Cardinals in the 30s, where the Cardinals, very carnivalesque atmosphere around baseball. They had their own country band. They played vaudeville in the off season. They saw themselves as performers. So Earl was from that era of baseball and saw himself as a performer. He had a temper, this again darkness I talked about from his uncle, who was probably abusive, and there was a lot of frustration and anger there that was never really addressed. In an era when men did not talk about their feelings or anxieties and drank their problems away. And then Earl, I think, eventually saw a strategic edge. But whatever the motivations, I mean, I've been trying to explain to younger audience members, like, this is the only comparison I can think of for now is professional wrestling, where this was like a side spectacle of baseball, the same way that fighting is in hockey. And so, the comedian Bill Burr said Earl was like Hulk Hogan in whipping up a crowd. And one writer said Earl playing Memorial Stadium was like Elvis playing Vegas. The Orioles were not that helpful. I think Earl kind of wore out his welcome his last 10 years in Baltimore. And then the Angeles family basically didn't want, a lot of work done on famous people who were there before they were. And so they would not help me. It was Ken Singleton, who's pictured here, who was in tremendous help, who gave me all these phone numbers of former Orioles, was a real super nice guy and really like, participated in the mission, the journalistic mission of telling the story, did not shy away from talking about Earl's drinking, but loved Earl and was, full of praise for him as a manager and his humor and him as a complete person. So I really am indebted to Ken in this project. And on the left, it's Chris Sale pitching to Adley Rutschman, the spring training, where the Orioles would not help me, but I bought a ticket and watched a lot of games anyway. I was also very interested in the role of the manager and how it's changed. And I befriended a bunch of major league managers coming through Pittsburgh. David Bell, there was a guy, David Bell's agent, played with me on the Brussels Kangaroos club baseball team in Belgium in the aughts, the 2000s. And so he introduced me to David, and David and I stayed in touch the whole season. And I was able to understand what a modern manager does and contrast it with Earl Weaver. It was Dave Roberts, the manager of the Dodgers, who I think crystallized the evolution when he told me, in the old days, you would say it's my team as a manager. Now you say it's our team, because in the old days, you'd travel with 35 people. The manager was the absolute ruler, the dictator of them all. Nowadays, the manager is like a CEO in a big organization with like 70 or 80 people on the road, nutritionists, trainers, mental skills people, different kinds of coaches. The agents are all there, and the manager's kind of in the middle. So they're very polished. I found all these guys like very smart, very polished, kind of like the CEOs that I used to cover at the Wall Street Journal. But they don't have that earthy quality that Billy Martin and Earl Weaver did. But they all remember they speak very very reverently about Earl Weaver and Billy Martin and that generation of managers. And I think one of the reasons the book works is that Earl Weaver, his name is legendary. Like when somebody hits a 3-run homer, they call that an Earl Weaver special. When somebody goes out to yell at an umpire, they call that, they reference Earl Weaver. I read every book about managers I could find, like this one about Ted Williams. What does a baseball manager do? And I became, very interested in that. it's still open. John Thorne, when I first started the project, he said, it's maybe the last thing we can never really answer. It's sort of unquantifiable, and teams still don't really know if a manager really can make a difference. But in the 70s, it was sure, people believe that if you hired a good manager, you could change a team's fortunes. That if you hired Ted Williams or Gene Mauch and Billy Martin, it would turn a bad team into a good team. And although Billy Martin was famous for his turnarounds, nobody believes that anymore. People now, they believe in teams being built as the sum of predictable performances by different players, and you put them all together, and you get a team with X wins. And the manager, might make a bit of a difference, but basically he's there to keep everybody happy and to maybe translate information from the front office to the players and triage information and kind of be the middle manager, if you will. And the GM is the hero of modern baseball organizations. All right, I know I did not cover the race question that somebody asked about. Again, nor did I talk about the video games, because Earl Weaver also played an important role in the development of this video game by EA Sports, Earl Weaver Baseball, which became the precursor to Madden Football, which became the greatest selling sports video game hit of all time. But I'm happy to talk more about those things, and I think we have plenty of time now to have a free-ranging conversation. Happy to answer your questions, and thanks for listening, everybody.
Okay, I'm getting back into gallery view here. So that was fantastic. That was really so I don't know how many people have read the book, and it's just really nice to see the photos and the background to go with everything. So yeah, like I think we'll just leave it to questions. So you can just kind of raise your hand if you want to put it in the chat. If you want to lay low, that's fine. But feel free to ask questions. Otherwise, I have plenty of my own.
I have a question. Is the Dan Mason there? Is that the Dan Mason from Rochester?
Dan Mason?
No, I'm not. We do get confused. I was
okay.
I worked for the Mets. I worked for ESPN Scouts Inc. as a scout.
Oh, cool. Because Dan is the GM of the Red Wings and was a big help. And Earl was in Rochester for a couple of years, and I traveled there too and had a great time. Anyway, nice to meet you.
I have plenty of questions. Sorry, I don't see you raise your hands, but I'm just going to jump on in. John, if you can't tell, I am a lifelong Orioles fan. I did go to American University, so we will not talk about the game. First, I'll try to keep it short as I can, because I could probably talk to you for an hour about Earl. I have a jersey in my closet I was going to wear, but numbers at the back. First, Ken Singleton was my favorite player, so I'm so glad he was very helpful to you. So 3 questions: one kind of about your research, one about Earl, one kind of kind of like the legacy Earl. So, well, first, I guess, did you find anything about that famous fake interview he did? That's obviously very famous.
Yeah.
Two, just real quick. 2, did he and Billy Martin really not like each other? And then 3rd, just in your research, I don't know how many players you talked to. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. Obviously, I'm excited about it. I don't know how many players you talked to, but besides Jim Palmer, who obviously has a photographic memory, how did you kind of relate what they said, talking about things that happened 40, 50 years ago? Like I said, Jim's got a photographic memory. I'm sure his memory is perfect, but everyone else, not always reliable thinking about games.
Like,
Thanks,
how did I check stuff?
Yeah, did you like take it for granted, or did you really research what everyone said to make sure it was accurate?
Yeah, sure. In order, the interview you're referring to, it's the manager's corner, where he's unbelievably dirty and funny. And yeah, so the sons of Tom Marr, who was the radio guy he did that with, they both talked to me, and they knew this story. It was a total satire. Earl and the radio guy cooked this up as a joke, and sent it in, not expecting it to be leaked, and it was. And now it's one of the most famous kind of vulgar tirades you can find in baseball. And it's also, to me, it speaks to the kind of free spiritedness and free thinkingness, and the sports people in the 70s and 80s, at least I've found, were a lot more just inclined to speak their minds and be funny and be open and take risks and say insane things for comedy, for entertainment, in a way that now is so buttoned down and corporate and very hard to get people to unmedia train themselves. And that was part of Earl's genius was being that funny and being that witty, sometimes in ways that were profound and you could talk about at the family dinner table, and sometimes in ways that were incredibly profane and vulgar and that you would not repeat. But that was the whole person. So I sort of love that he did that as a send up. And I was happy to include that in the book and explain where that came from. The second one was, sorry, remind me.
He and Billy Martin really not get along.
But yeah, no, I don't think they got along. I think they would say things in the paper that were very vicious. Like, next time I see that guy, I'm going to punch him in the teeth. And Billy said, if I finish second to Earl Weaver next year, I'm going to shoot myself. And Earl, he would say things that made him sound like he felt sorry for Billy. He would say things like, Billy Martin understands baseball, but he doesn't understand life. And Billy's alcoholism, killed him in the end. He died in a drunk driving accident. And there was a lightness and kind of a sweetness to Earl Weaver that Billy Martin never had. Everybody said Billy Martin was kind of mean, and Earl, for all his flaws and his alcoholism, what was essentially a nicer person, I think. And they were not friends. And maybe George Steinbrenner always wanted to hire Earl Weaver and never could, and so maybe Billy was jealous too. As far as sourcing, yeah, I mean, the online newspaper archives help a lot. Player memoirs, Earl's memoirs, obviously taken with a grain of salt. He, even in his memoirs, doesn't talk that much about what a good player he was his first 4 years in the minors. So that came from mostly newspaper clippings where they're talking about him being this jewel in the Cardinals farm system, and they talk about him being a surefire future big league second baseman. And I think he was probably embarrassed that he had that much potential and then essentially blew it.
Thanks. Appreciate it. And again, looking forward to reading it. I could talk to you for an hour, but I'll let others chime in. Thanks a lot.
I was just fascinated by, his skill set, the fact that he was, for a star manager, he's very funny. He was a show unto himself, but he was just incredibly perceptive and really knew the art of persuasion, the attention to detail, his use of rudimentary analytics back in that time. But the strategy of, just the solid defense and especially the pitching. So it's so funny because they thought, the players would say, oh, Earl doesn't know anything about pitching, but, they had this strategy of throwing, they wanted them to throw strikes. They didn't want them to walk anybody. So it was better to throw it down the middle and just change speeds than to try to nibble and get in trouble. So is that strategy still generally used? I know you're a coach, and I know we have at least a couple of other coaches here.
Yeah, I mean, I've embraced it honestly for high school because I got tired of, in high school, you often hear, hit your spots, and most teenagers can't. And so if you actually charted kids in the off season, if you throw it down the middle, it's probably gonna end up on the corners anyway. And so I've embraced this idea of throwing lots of change ups and changing speeds, which essentially is the Oriole way. And they didn't lead the league in strikeouts hardly ever, but they were always very high in fewest walks allowed. And then the batting average, Jim Palmer's batting average against was 250 on balls in play, and during a time the rest of the league's batting average on balls in play was 280. So the Orioles is very much in part of having this superior defense and having these pitchers that threw strikes and giving up plenty of solo home runs, but not giving away free runners. And there's a story where in Rochester where Earl's going crazy and he's telling this pitcher, if you walk this guy, you're going back to Elmira. And the guy walks the guy, and then sure enough, they send him back to Elmira.
Just fascinating. Yeah, it seems to be like a winning strategy. And I think any of us who, even if you just played softball, if you have somebody who's just walking everybody, you're flat-footed, and then you
can't defend a walk.
Yeah.
I've got
any other questions?
Yeah, I've got a couple of comments on baseball strategy as it applies to Earl. He liked walks and he liked home runs, and in that regard, he was kind of ahead of the curve, or at least the known thinking, because now we talk about OPS, and that's what that strategy amounted to, walks and home runs. And then also you were talking about how Weaver liked the ball to be thrown down the middle. And maybe you remember Don Stanhouse, a relief pitcher. He'd come in, load the bases, I'm sure that drove Earl crazy. you know, and Earl didn't seem to have any influence on him. He just kept walking guys.
Don Stanhouse called me probably after 3 cocktails, and he said, he left a message. He said, "Anybody with the balls to write a book about Earl is somebody I should talk to." And I called him back like 10 times, and we never we never connected. So that's my Don Stanhouse story. But yeah, Earl, I mean, the Orioles won 6 Cy Young Awards with Earl, and they didn't win one before, and they haven't won one since. So this idea that he didn't know anything about pitching, I think, is a big lie. And about the strategy, Dave, the first half of his career as a manager, the Orioles actually bunted over league average, and because they had Mark Belanger, who was a terrible hitter and a great defender, and they had this pitching and defense team. And it was only towards the end when he had this team of parts with people like Gary Renicky and John Lowenstein, Benny Ayala, and then obviously Singleton, that had more power, that he realized that he would embrace that, and he basically stopped bunting as much. So in this first press conference, he said, "We're going to bunt a lot," and so that's also what tipped me off that there's this complexity there, this evolution, where he was somebody who was always open to change, which I think makes, again, a great character for a book.
So we have a couple of hands up. I think Francis and then Mike Hubbard.
Yes, I just was interested in that photograph you had of the St. Louis boyhood home of Earl Weaver. And it looked like, if I looked at it correctly, that it's now a vacant lot with a plaque on it. Is that correct?
Oh, is there a plaque there? I don't know if there is. That's in a lot of the books, like the guidebooks that tell you about where to go in St. Louis. It's a good question. I can.
Yeah, it looked like there was perhaps a plaque toward the back of the lot.
I'm looking right now. Yeah. Yeah, no, there's a sign. I don't see it. I don't think there is,
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I was just wondering if it was marked that way, because he as I understood you, I believe he lived in the area of the vacant lot. Is
That's
that
right.
correct?
Yeah. North St. Louis. I mean, it's very sad. It's very desolate and economically devastated now.
Mhm.
Like a lot of, it's a lost world. I mean, it's a lot of American cities after suburbanization and white flight in the 60s and economic ruin. It's also this, again, I grew up in Europe, and so for me to discover American cities, I found very interesting the historical part of it.
Mhm. Yes, well, I was just curious about that, but I appreciate you clarifying it. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
And it sounds his life is a fascinating story.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And it also takes you from, again, the world of vaudeville, and I mean, the Cardinals would walk from the train station to the ballpark, often with instruments. And Frankie Fritsch, the manager, said, "I felt like we traveled with more instruments than baseball gear." And they had their own country, the cowboy band. And of course, Saber being Saber, I met a guy who had written a whole paper just about the musicality of the Cardinals team, and who played the mandolin, who played the guitar, who played it was amazing at this, one of the Saber conferences. I forget his name, but he might be here tonight. But he had written this entire 10,000 word paper about the musicians on the Cardinals in the 30s. And so from that world to jet travel and computers is the Earl Weaver story.
Yeah.
Thanks, Francis. Mike, I think you're up.
Yeah, so thanks, John, for the presentation. That was terrific. And I actually have a very similar question to Francis. I happen to be in St. Louis right now, and so I was wondering if you had the address. I'd love to swing by and see where Earl Weaver used to live.
I think it's 4713 Northland Avenue.
That is in a tough part of town, yeah.
It is, yeah. And then St. Louis, the place where he was born, which is not as well known, is St. Louis Avenue. If you email me, I can I'll put my email in the chat. You can
Oh, thank you.
I can tell you, yeah. And actually I hired a researcher, Tim Metcalf, who's a crime like a sort of crime storyteller, like told stories about the mob and ghost stories, that kind of thing. And he took me around all these neighborhoods and took me to different archives in St. Louis, Missouri Historical Society, and found where I found a lot of things, like including yearbooks, and there was this magazine called Prom that covered youth culture, which is sort of like the what Instagram is today. They had a magazine back then that covered like what kids were doing in the 40s, and Earl was in that magazine sometimes as a teenage baseball player, and he was really famous, and people talked about what a brilliant athlete. I mean, this guy played football. He was a star running back. He was on an a basketball team that won a state championship. So this is like a young, like energetic, kind of like a stud athlete. And people, high school classmates, there was one guy who was still alive, told me, after he graduated, people would talk about what an incredible athlete this guy was, which is funny because people change, and you see this guy as an old man, and he's had too many cigarettes and too much alcohol, and he sort of seems like he's couldn't be that person, but he was that person.
Anyone else? Yeah, so I wanted to just comment on something you wrote. So early on in the book, so you talked about his Uncle Bud, who I guess was he an operative with Al Capone, and he was definitely in the wrong circles, but just how Earl used to attend games with his Uncle Bud, and there were the gamblers, and you wrote something to the effect that you didn't think would baseball have developed as a sport without gambling, and we're talking about back in the 1800s.
Yeah, that's our friend Tom Gilbert's research, Mary.
Yeah.
In Tom's book, How Baseball Happened, I think talks about this. Yeah, baseball as a spectator sport was propelled by interest from gamblers. I mean, baseball, because of its very binary outcomes, ball strike, out safe, is a perfect sport for gambling because you have so many discrete events that have like clear outcomes, and you have pauses where you can make the bet. So one thing that was interesting was finding that, I had this idea that there was a Black Sox scandal, and then gambling kind of went away, which was complete baloney. Like bookies and gamblers were there in the 30s, they were there in the 40s. If you read old newspaper archives, you see like, every year they say, this year we're going to kick out the gamblers. And then they have stories about they're still there. And then this year we're going to kick out the gamblers. And it never happened because it was good for the business of the teams, which is why the teams welcome them now. And now, Uncle Bud was part of the mob, but that was essentially the informal economy of American cities where they usually weren't dropping bodies. They were just running these parts of the economy that were illegal. And now it's completely legal, and you go on your phone and bet on FanDuel or DraftKings or whatever. And major league teams welcome that because it brings in money, and they welcomed it in the 40s. So that was kind of a lie I was happy to debunk. And then Earl Weaver's Uncle Bud was part of that. And they would stand in the right field grandstand and take prop bets on pitch counts and when the starting pitcher would come out of the game. And yeah, there was millions of dollars wagered every day on Major League Baseball in the 40s. And so then, yeah, and those gambling guides speak to that too. I mean, there wouldn't be a need for gambling guides if there weren't, gamblers.
Yeah, I mean, it really makes sense, and it's throughout baseball's history because the Negro Leagues they have been around without the money from the numbers rackets and the owners being able to prop up these teams, and even like the Cubs. I mean, that's why we still have Wrigley Field, because even up to into the 60s, all the side betting and it was full of gamblers in the bleachers, and at least they kept Wrigley going and the Cubs. So although we have a lot of Brewers and Twins
the other
fans
person,
here.
a modern baseball person who was incredibly helpful to me was Dan Duquette, because he loved Earl, and Dan was GM of 3 teams, the Expos, Red Sox, and Orioles, and he would bring Earl to spring training and have him like lecture coaches about strategy, and he just loved Earl. And he said, Earl talked like a bookmaker, and when you look at clips, the newspaper clips, Earl, you sort of catch it with a different eye when he says things like, this game was like the time I bet on 2 dogs and they bit each other coming out of the gate. And just a very like, colorful, and he was smart, like a street hustler is smart. And this is the guy who did not go to college, but would pick up information everywhere and would quote Shakespeare or say things that were like really surprisingly witty. And that's why people like, Roger Angel and these New York writers, intellectuals fell in love with him, because he was so smart and intelligent, even though he was this sort of tough guy and a street guy and a hustler guy.
Absolutely. And would you like to comment on his relationship with Black players? Because I think he had
Oh yeah,
admitted
yeah,
that he grew
yeah.
up
So
as
there were
racist as everybody was back then, and then
yeah, there were
interesting.
two. Yeah, there were two clues to what happened, or at least his origins. I mean, one was his family, who just flat out told me when when he was young, in St. Louis, they used racial slurs, and it was very just baked into the culture. And then he went to the Deep South, and that didn't help. And he was in Georgia, and then in his own memoir, he says, "When I was young, I had all the same prejudices of people from St. Louis," and he is very blunt about that. But then he writes, when I got to the major leagues, I realized that people are people. There's good people and bad people in every culture and race, and it doesn't matter where you're from, and et cetera. And he really does sort of open up. And then Ken Dixon, who was an Orioles player in the 80s, black player, loved Earl and just told me, like the thing about Earl was, he was rough, he was coarse, but he treated you like a man. So he told this story about how he called him into his office and he said to Ken Dixon, I want you to do your effing job. And Ken said it was a kind of level of like expectation that was like honest and had this integrity, whereas other coaches would kind of almost spit at his feet. And one coach called him boy, and there was real racism. Whereas Earl, he was like kind of tough, but he was also he treated everybody equally, and he loved Eddie Murray. Eddie Murray loved Earl. Ken Singleton loved Earl. Reggie Jackson loved Earl, and then Frank Robinson. Earl hired him as a bench coach in the late 70s, and Frank really wanted to manage and was on the record saying that. And when Earl got to Baltimore, he had been managing the Santurce Crabbers team in Puerto Rico in the winter, and Earl, was going to be busy with the Orioles, and so was going to step down from that job. And he had a choice of who to recommend as his successor, and he chose Frank Robinson. And I think it wasn't entirely, Earl was not interested in racial justice as a kind of concept in itself. He was interested in winning and interested in building relationships. And but in that sense, he was colorblind, if you will, because he wanted to get on Frank Robinson's good side and help that relationship. And so he recommended that Frank be the next manager of the Santurce Crabbers. And that was the first time that Frank managed big leaguers in a kind of professional setting. And then he did really well. And Earl went out of his way to talk about what a great manager he was. And when the Senators hired Ted Williams, Earl gave an interview and said, they actually should have hired Frank Robinson. He would be a better manager than Ted Williams. And he didn't have to say those things, but he did. And when Frank became a big league manager, which is almost 50 years ago next month, it was in large part credit to Earl. And they remained friends and had this respectful. I don't think they were close friends, but there was a lot of respect. And again, Earl, in that sense, was truly colorblind in that he saw people as people and had this honesty and integrity to him, and also a capacity again for evolution. And Tom Boswell told me, Earl's his favorite saying of Earl, and Tom wrote this email to me, which I treasure because this is a guy I idolized him as a writer, as a young person. And so Tom Boswell wrote to me, Earl's favorite saying of his was, "Everything changes everything." And he had this capacity for evolution, for thinking about things in a new way that was unique among baseball people, which is very, groupthink mindset. People don't think outside the box very much. Everybody kind of goes with the flow, especially in the 70s. And Earl will break that mold time and time again. Like when the radar gun came along, Earl was the one who raised his hand and said, "Yep, I'll try that." Other people might be afraid of it, but Earl was like, "Oh, it's going to be a great tool to measure pitchers' velocities. We're going to use that." And I think the same way with race, he was able to evolve and think about things in a different way.
Interesting. We're getting close to 9 o'clock, I think. So I don't want to take too much of your time. Are there any questions?
And one, what was his relationship with the coaches? I know he had quite a few, like Billy Hunter and George Bamberger, who were stuck with him for a long time. But how did he get along with the coaches that he had, and
Yeah,
yes.
that's a good question, and it allows me to tell one of my favorite stories from the reporting, which was, I chased obviously the biggest name I had to interview, because Palmer loves talking about Earl, so that was not that hard. But Cal Ripken was hard to track down, hard to get to talk to me. But once he did, he would talk to me for a full hour, and a lot of it was about his dad, and Earl and his dad had been together for decades, and Cal was the only player who would not tell me stories about Earl's drinking, but he did say, he said Earl and my dad would go to the bar, and Earl would fire dad, And then the next morning he would rehire him, and maybe drinking had something to do with that. So that was a funny story. But Earl, like he had his band of merry men. He had this rule that players could not drink in the hotel bar. That was for his coaches. So he was friends with them. One of his funny quotes was, um, the best qualification for a coach is to be a good pinochle player. So he loved, like, playing poker, playing cards, being on the road with these guys. And a lot of them became big league managers. I mean, Billy Hunter managed the Rangers. There was Jim Frey, I think, Cal Senior, John. A lot of people came out of that organization and ended up being running baseball teams. John Schuerholz. But yeah, I would say that except for his pitching coaches, where George Bamberger and Ray Miller were kind of great pitching coaches, the rest of them, I think Earl just wanted people he could trust and wanted his friends, people he could drink and play cards with, and would help him and protect him, because again, he was kind of a messy person, and sometimes would pass out in the lobbies of hotels, and he would need people he could trust to take him to his room.
Well, I'm like Dave Heller. I could talk to you forever about this. I'm not even an Orioles fan. So yeah, I highly recommend the book. So we'll do our drawing. Is there a better way to get your book? For those in Milwaukee, it's in Boswell. I know that. Our Boswell Books is a great local bookstore.
Yeah, I very much am promoting local bookstores. The one in Pittsburgh that has all the I've signed all of them. So if you want a signed copy, is a White Whale bookstore in Pittsburgh. The audiobook by a Chicago actor named Johnny Heller is wonderful. I support Johnny's work. So, and that's on Spotify Premium, for free. So if you already have Spotify, you can listen to it. Again, it's really, really good. So the audiobook's really good. And then, yeah, White Whale in Pittsburgh would be my two tips here.
Excellent. Yeah. There's just like, you just read it. There's so many fascinating nuggets, like Jim Palmer when he was growing up playing catch with his butler.
Oh yeah. Jim was from a wealthy family, and that was part of their conflict was their height. They were, Earl was so short and Jim was tall, and but also a class difference where Earl was from this, again, street hustlers culture in St. Louis, and Jim was from a family so wealthy. Yeah, he learned baseball playing catch with his butler.
Yeah. No, in fact, for those into baseball history, like when we met, it was like, oh my gosh, it seems so similar to John McGraw and Christy Mathewson, the class difference. And yeah, although they were friends, Palmer and Weaver weren't friends, I don't think.
They would golf together. And then there was, because of Jim lost his father to a heart attack when he was 9 years old. There was a very complicated psychological dynamic. And one of the absolute highlights of this whole project has been Jim Palmer on a Saturday night tweeting about how much he was learning about Earl Weaver from my book. He did not know that he had been a good athlete. He did not know about his uncle. All these things he did not know, and Jim was saying, there was more to him than I thought. But he's so emotional about Earl still. And at Earl's funeral, I mean, Jim was crying and talked about how it was like a love affair. I mean, using words like love affair, like their relationship is so interesting. I mean, again, people forget, but Earl won the most games of any manager in the 70s. Jim won the most games of any pitcher in the American League. So they were at the very top of the baseball world, very top of the American sports world, but would bicker all the time like a married couple who could never stay happy.
It's a good way to look at it. Yeah, life is complicated. So let's do the drawing, Dennis.
Yes. I'm on chapter 4, John, so thank you for not giving anything too serious away there. I'm trying to work my way through this, and I got a 2-year-old great grandson I'm chasing all day long. So by about the time I get ready to read, I got to catch up on other things. So thank you as soon as I saw this book was coming out, we growing up in Earl Weaver generation, and having faced them as a Brewer fan, I thought it'd be a fascinating book. So thank you for writing it. Drawing, I need a number between 1 and 23. No, 22.
From me?
Yes.
Well,
You get to pick, John, if you want.
I'm gonna pick number 4 because that's Earl's number, and he got it from Marty Marion. Earl was a big fan of Marty Marion, who was a tall shortstop, and so when Earl moved Cal to shortstop, he thought about Marty Marion.
And John, I'm not saying this just to win the book, but Thanks a lot for spending time with us. It was a great presentation.
Oh, thanks, guys. I appreciate you guys very much. Thank you.
And David didn't work. You're not number 4, but Daniel Dorf is. Is Dan still on? We've got 22 still on. Dan, are you out there somewhere?
I'm looking for him right now.
Yeah, I don't see
Can we
it.
pick another number?
Yeah, I think Daniel left. He's the secretary of Halsey Hall chapter here in the Twin Cities.
Well, Dennis almost always wins.
Who always wins?
You almost always win, Dennis.
By the way, I have to say, because I always do these talks and I think I didn't say enough funny things. Earl was so funny. In Minneapolis one night, Earl stood up and said, "Where's the toilet?" And somebody said, "In your mouth."
Well, you did tell the story about the umpire saying you should read my book, and he's like,
yeah,
I can't. It's in Braille, which is pretty quick. Yeah, that's pretty funny. So should we get it to him, or
My feeling is yes. We pulled it. He signed
we
in.
can get his email address? And
Yeah, he's
I'll
a
contact him.
SABR member. I can get his address online. So yeah, I can reach out to him. So yeah, Daniel Dorf is the winner of the book. So, and I kind of like it because it's Earl's number. So it's, so yeah.
Well, I want to thank you, John, for your time, and it was just fascinating to talk with you and and watch your presentation. And thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. And just a couple of upcoming events. I know the Emil Rothe chapter is having a virtual meeting on April 9th with Zach Ford. We'll have Cat Williams on April 10th. Again, you can just check the SABR events calendar. Does Halsey Hall or Central Illinois want to add anything to that? Otherwise, we'll call it a night. Yeah.
Hang on, Mary.
Guys, good night.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Our spring meeting on April 12th.
Oh.
I added Vinny Rotino today is going to be speaking along with Michael Bauman. So we got 2 pretty good speakers for the spring meeting.
Excellent.
I would like to recommend to the people who are still at this meeting that in the March edition of the Ken Keltner newsletter, there's an interesting interview with Bob Euchre. If you haven't heard it, I recommend that you do hear it, where when he went out to try out for Major League Baseball, he went out and tried out as a pitcher, and the manager told him to try to get a job.
Is that the Larry Baldessaro
Yes.
interview? Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, I highly recommend. Yeah. You can find it maybe on YouTube, or it's through the SABR website. It's through the oral histories. Yeah.
It was on the SABR. It was in the SABR This Week in SABR a couple of weeks ago also. So yeah.
Anybody else?